Introduction to Francis Schaeffer. Writing about Francis A. Schaeffer in 1997, Michael Hamilton said that perhaps no intellectual, save C.S. Lewis, affected the thinking of evangelicals more profoundly. Perhaps no leader of the period, save Billy Graham, left a deeper stamp on the movement as a whole. Schaeffer's work has influenced many contemporary Christian thinkers, including Douglas Blount, Jerome Barrs, William Edgar, Os Guinness, Nick Pollard, David Wells, Vishal Mangalwadi, Ranald Macaulay, and Nancy Pearcey. Francis August Schaeffer, 1912 to 1984, was born of German and English ancestry. He became a Christian after becoming convinced that the Bible could answer world-view questions that philosophers raised, but he didn't think philosophers answered. In 1935, Schaeffer graduated from Hampton Sydney College and married Edith Saville. She was the daughter of missionary parents who'd been with the China Inland Mission. Edith, 1914 to 2013, wrote several books. Francis Schaeffer went to Westminster Theological Seminary, where he studied briefly under apologists Cornelius Van Til and J. Gresham Machen, before transferring to Faith Theological Seminary, from which he graduated in 1938. Now, Faith Theological Seminary was newly formed due to a split between the Presbyterian Church of America and the Bible Presbyterian Church. The Bible Presbyterian Church was a fundamentalist and separatist church with a premillennial eschatology, that is, they believed Jesus would return to earth to exercise a 1,000-year reign of peace before the Last Judgment. And they were a church that forbade so-called liberties, such as dancing, theatre, gambling, drinking alcohol, and smoking. Schaeffer served pastorates in Pennsylvania and Missouri, and in 1948 the Schaeffers moved to Switzerland as missionaries. Then Francis went through a spiritual crisis in 1951, primarily concerning the lack of love in the church communities he'd been part of. In 1955, the Schaeffers established L'Abri, that's French for the shelter, a sort of spiritual community / philosophy seminar that attracted thousands of young people. L'Abri expanded into Sweden, France, the Netherlands, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. William Edgar writes that Schaeffer went through a spiritual crisis where he'd come to wonder whether he had so stressed doctrinal orthodoxy that he failed to exercise the requisite application of Christian faith to every area of life. Especially, he had thought that he lacked love and compassion for those with whom he had disagreed. After months of self-examination, pacing up and down the hayloft in their chalet, he came to the conclusion that he had forgotten about walking with the Lord moment by moment and the application of the Christian faith to all of life. This included not only the arts, but every kind of human interaction. And eventually the Schaeffers broke with the Bible Presbyterian Church and became independent faith missionaries. L'Abri Fellowship was officially born in 1955. It really began with friends of the Schaeffers' first daughter, Priscilla, coming home with her from the university and asking questions about Christianity, truth, and the issues of life. At first, meetings and services were held in the Schaeffer's home, but then it moved to an abandoned Protestant church. And by word of mouth, the news spread to university students that there was a place in the Swiss Alps where one could get honest answers to life's deepest questions. In short order, students were coming to L'Abri every weekend, and they developed a pattern of meals, walks, talks, and a Sunday church service, all geared towards providing an atmosphere that would stimulate conversation about philosophical and religious ideas. L'Abri operated on 4 basic principles. 1, they would not ask for money, but would make their needs known to God. 2, they would not recruit staff, but depend on God to send the right people. 3, they'd only plan short term, so as to depend on God's guidance. And 4, they would not publicize themselves, but would trust God to send them people in need. Schaeffer's approach to culture was heavily influenced by his friendship with the Dutch professor Hans Ruckmacher, a Christian historian of art. Schaeffer said that Christian art is the expression of the whole life of the whole person as a Christian. What a Christian portrays in his art is the totality of life. Art's not meant to be solely a vehicle for some sort of self-conscious evangelism. He who loses the arts loses the culture, said Schaeffer. Thus, if we are to communicate the Christian faith effectively, we must know and understand the thought forms of our own generation. As David P. Hoover observes, Schaeffer often said that he was interested in giving honest answers to honest questions. Hoover says it was Schaeffer's contention that Christianity must become culturally deep if it is to be a formative power for our times. Thus, for a great many students, a dry as dust scholastic apologetics gave way to a culturally aware diagnostic apologetics. And whether in a popular lecture or in any of his books, his style is a rustic, almost thinking out loud affair, yet it's just this quality at the personal level that proves to be so winsome. Philosopher J. Budzinski summarizes Schaeffer's apologetic methodology. Presuppositionalists, he held, are right to assert that the ultimate premises of Christian and anti-Christian systems of thought are utterly at odds. On the other hand, evidentialists are right to assert that between Christian and anti-Christian systems of thought, there is always a point of contact in the shape of reality itself. The reason for this point of contact, he argued, is that non-believers cannot bring themselves to be completely consistent with their own presuppositions. And this inconsistency is a result of God having made a defined and unavoidable creation. Thus, illogically, he wrote, men have in their accepted worldviews various amounts of that which is ours, which is the Christians. But, illogical though it may be, it's there, and we can appeal to it. Philosopher Douglas K. Blount writes that Schaeffer's apologetic strategy juxtaposes historic Christian orthodoxy's presuppositions with those of various unbelieving worldviews. He seeks to show the superiority of Christian presuppositions over those of alternative worldviews by showing that only the former can satisfactorily account for the world and our place in it. Only Christian presuppositions, he argues, adequately explain the external world of public objective reality and the internal world of one's own subjective humanity, with its concomitant desires for significance, meaning, and love. In Schaeffer's view, the rejection of God led Western culture to cross what he called a line of despair, after which people despaired of traditional notions such as human freedom and dignity, or the ability to reliably know and communicate truth. Schaeffer was really diagnosing what we would call the postmodern results of the modernist worldview. While Schaeffer has been criticised for getting some of the details of the history of ideas wrong, one might still think that his overall diagnosis was largely correct. Schaeffer said, "Modern man resides in a two-story universe. In the lower story is the finite world without God. Here, life is absurd. In the upper story are meaning, value, and purpose. Now, modern man lives in the lower story because he believes there is no God. But he cannot live happily in such an absurd world. Therefore, he continually makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose, even though he has no right to, since he does not believe in God. Modern man is totally inconsistent when he makes this leap, because these values cannot exist without God, and man, in his lower story, does not have God." Hoover writes that what Schaeffer appears to be doing, especially in He Is There and He Is Not Silent, is to begin implicitly with Christianity as a model that best accounts for and explains the greatest range of data within one's world of experience. For example, that there exists something rather than nothing at all, or that there is and always has been a moral dimension to human life, and that one can know things, are all explained and explained well by the biblical revelation. Schaeffer contrasts his interpretation of the biblical worldview with naturalism, which he argues fails to account for or to explain key realities. However, as Hoover says, these major contentions of Schaeffer are at best poorly argued, and at worst, not argued at all. Indeed, Hoover notes that Schaeffer is not a professionally trained philosopher. So, from a philosophical point of view, Schaeffer's arguments are suggestive and underdeveloped. As Hoover says, more often than not, it appears that Schaeffer depends upon the intuitions of his listeners or readers. Well, of course, those with the right intuitions will find his arguments persuasive. Schaeffer wrote that every person has the pull of two consistencies: the pull towards the real world and the pull towards the logic of his system. To have to choose between one consistency or the other is a real damnation for man. The more logical a man who holds a non-Christian position is, to his own presuppositions, the further he is from the real world, and the nearer he is to the real world, the more illogical he is to his presuppositions. The first consideration in our apologetics for modern man is to find the place where his tension exists. When we have discovered, as well as we can, a person's point of tension, the next step is to push him towards the logical conclusion of his presuppositions. Every man has built a roof over his head to shield himself at the point of tension. At the point of tension, the person is not in a place of consistency in his system, and the roof is built as a protection against the blows of the real world, both internal and external. The Christian lovingly must remove the shelter and allow the truth of the external world and of what man is to beat upon him. When the roof is off, each man must stand naked and wounded before the truth of what is. The truth that we let in first is not a dogmatic statement of the truth of scriptures, but the truth of the external world and the truth of what man himself is. This is what shows him his need. The scriptures then show him the real nature of his lostness and the answer to it. Here's a couple of quotes from Schaeffer on the purpose of apologetics that give a holistic definition of this purpose. Schaeffer said that the purpose of apologetics is not just to win an argument or a discussion, but that the people with whom we are in contact may become Christians and then live under the lordship of Christ in the whole spectrum of life. He said, I am only interested in an apologetic that leads in two directions, and the one is to lead people to Christ as Saviour, and the other is that after they are Christians, for them to realize the lordship of Christ in the whole of life. If Christianity is truth, it ought to touch on the whole of life. Christianity must never be reduced merely to an intellectual system. After all, if God is there, it isn't just an answer to an intellectual question. We're called upon to adore him, to be in a relationship to him, and incidentally, to obey him. Schaeffer wrote 22 books covering a wide range of issues. Schaeffer was persuaded to adapt his 1976 book, How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture, into a documentary film that came out in 1977. In 1979, Schaeffer and longtime friend and former US Surgeon General Dr. C. Everett Koop co-produced a book and a film series encouraging people to take a stand against abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia, entitled Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Scholars discuss the extent to which Schaeffer moved away from his fundamentalist roots. Schaeffer's emphasis on the arts and his engagement with issues such as ecology were not typical of fundamentalism. On the one hand, Schaeffer championed biblical inerrancy in opposition to the neo-orthodoxy of Swiss theologian Karl Barth. But on the other hand, Schaeffer criticized American evangelist Billy Graham for calling for an emotional decision. Although Schaeffer thought of the entire book of Genesis as historic and thought it was to be read in normal fashion with the common use of words and syntax, he was open to interpreting the creation days as long periods of time, and so was not committed to so-called young earth creationism. So let's think about Schaeffer's legacy. Schaeffer played a leading role in getting evangelical Christians to reject a sacred-secular split in their thinking and in promoting a holistic approach to Christian discipleship, prepared to engage with the philosophical ideas, artistic expressions, and ethical discussions in society. And he played a leading role in applying this holistic approach uh, to Christian apologetics, within Christian apologetics. Schaeffer put his finger on several key problems with the naturalistic, modern, and postmodern worldviews that dominated 20th century culture, especially problems concerning truth and meaning, human dignity, freedom, and morality. And while Schaeffer lacked formal training in philosophy, and while his treatment of the history of ideas left something to be desired, the problems he identified have been taken up with depth and rigour by contemporary Christian philosophers. Schaeffer blazed a trail in communicating Christian thinking through making documentary films, and Schaeffer sought to speak truth in love. As Pastor Gregory Reynolds says, for all of the superficial and sometimes grossly inaccurate treatment of history and philosophy, Schaeffer gave many of us hope in the face of the despair we had encountered in the modern world. Schaeffer was the only Christian leader I knew who was addressing the modern world with any kind of penetration and in the cultural language that I understood. Many of us would learn that within specific disciplines there are better scholars, but he was our pastor and a deeply compassionate man. Oddly, his apologetics focused on ideas as the only element in people's presuppositions, excluding other dimensions of human commitment and loyalty. Yet, in his own practice, he demonstrated his claim that love was the final apologetic. As Hoover says, Schaeffer genuinely loves those he confronts. I have on several occasions witnessed Schaeffer, tired and spent after an hour's lecture, perhaps the third such lecture in a single day, taking an additional hour or two, talking and witnessing to a cluster of young people gathered around him. This is the Schaeffer that best accounts for the L'Abri phenomenon. As historian Barry Hankins says, while he utilized ideas from philosophy, Schaeffer was not a professional philosopher. Throughout his career, he would get some of the details wrong when discussing Western intellectual history, though his overall analysis would often be helpful for Christians trying to understand the larger picture. Schaeffer's analysis is not without its difficulties, to be sure, but on topics ranging from drug use to art and poetry, Schaeffer was getting evangelical young people to think in a new way about their world.